So, Michele Levine again. You've just recently done a poll of the New Zealand electorate, which the results of which I think are going to be quite surprising to the people here, given the events of the last few days. Perhaps we could start this part of the interview talking about that.
Sure. Well, yes, Roy Morgan's actually conducted a poll. It was surveyed up until yesterday, and what we find in that poll is that the Nationals are clearly set for election victory on Saturday. We have the John Key's National Party with 53% of the primary vote. That's unchanged, but the lead to the Labor Party has gained because the Labor Party at 24.5% is actually down 1.5. Support for the Greens is 13%, up 1%. And New Zealand First at 3% is down 1.5%. ACT at 1.5% is up 0.5%. And the Maori Party at 3% is up 1%. And the Mana Party is unchanged at 1%. So what we've got is that the Nationals look really in a very good position with 53% of that primary vote, although the Greens are looking, they're the other party that's up.
You also have a state of the are we headed in the right direction poll?
Yes, there's an important question. We ask people whether they think the country is going in the right direction or not, and we find 60.5% of New Zealanders say the country is heading in the right direction. That's in fact up 2%, and it's very important because in tough economic times particularly, whether the country is going in the right direction is pretty important, and it's a good indicator for the government, the party that's in power at the moment. So those things all augur well for the National Party.
That's a relatively high reporting for the right direction in general, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. It's a very solid figure, but then the National Party is looking very solid. We're not seeing a great deal of any problems facing the National Party. It's polling solidly, and that right direction is a very solid measure as well.
Now, in terms of the timing of this poll, it was conducted over the last 10 days till Friday. Yes. And you said earlier that you think about 20% of it was affected by the teapot saga of last week, but that hasn't really showed up in it at all.
No, I think this poll really, although it occurred at the time that the teapot saga, as we're calling it, occurred, this poll showing the Nationals unchanged since the previous poll suggests that there's not been an impact in this polling. However, we would expect that if there is going to be some kind of impact through the teapot tape saga, that will actually show up in the following week. So we'll be polling on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week, which will be obviously after this weekend, and it will be after the debate between the leaders. And so if there's going to be a lasting effect either way of this teapot saga, then that's the poll that it will show up in.
Now, in the last few elections, I think we've noticed that the polling, the last-minute polls and the final results don't necessarily line up completely. Is there a particular reason why that's the case?
Well, any poll, all a poll can do, even the best constructed poll, is measure how people say they're going to vote at that time. Now, we believe people are pretty honest in what they say, but one of the really important findings that we've noticed in all of our election day polling is that 22% of people say they made up their mind actually in the polling booth. And that seems like an extraordinarily high number. But I suppose people like us and politicians who spend our lives following polls, we sort of think everyone's thinking about politics all the time. And the reality is they're just not. So, you've got a bunch of people who are sort of rusted on Labor voters and a lot of people who are rusted on National voters. And you know how they're going to vote. But then in the middle, you've got people who either are going to make their mind up at the last minute because they're really undecided and they're following every issue carefully. But there's a whole lot of people who'll be actually really not taking a whole lot of notice about the whole thing right up until they get into the polling booth. Then they look and they think, right, I have to make this decision. So trying to really predict exactly how the poll will turn out on that day is very, very difficult.
So the other thing you've been doing the last few days is polling New Zealanders on their attitudes in terms of what issues are most important to them in this election.
Yes.
What were your findings there?
Yes, we asked two questions, two open-ended questions. So we asked what's the most important issue facing the world, and what's the most important issue facing New Zealand? And people say anything they like in their own words, and then we have a look at it. And what we found for the world, first of all, is that more people in New Zealand have recognised that economic issues are a really big problem around the world. So 49% of New Zealanders say the biggest issue facing the world are things to do with the economy. When it comes to New Zealand, what's the most important issue facing New Zealand? The economy's always been pretty strong. So we see 49% also saying the economy is the biggest issue facing New Zealand. That's unchanged from the last poll, but it's still a very, very solid number, and not surprising. What is interesting within that, though, is 9% of people are saying unemployment is the biggest issue facing New Zealand. And 9% is pretty important. It's a big number. In Australia, we've just gone from 2% to 5% of Australians saying unemployment's the biggest issue, and we think that's an enormous jump. We think that's very important. So 9% is very substantial. So we see the big issue being all sorts of things economic, which of course plays into the National Party as being the party that deals best with economic issues. And also it relates well to that question of, is the country going in the right direction? So when people are concerned about the economy and they have the National Party in power and they're relatively comfortable with the direction of the country, that augurs well for the government that's in power at the moment. The other issue that's increased in importance in New Zealand is things to do with the environment. And that's now up to 19%. So 19% of New Zealanders say environmental issues are the biggest problem facing New Zealand. Now, in New Zealand, that really is a reflection of a series of environmental disasters. So we had in total 19%, but we had 6% talking about the oil spills, the Rena oil spill as the biggest issue facing New Zealand. And of course, you've had earthquakes. So the environmental issues in New Zealand are solid things that people have seen and felt, and that's coming through quite strongly, and maybe relating